The woman's fingers slip from the hull of the ship. Salt water fills her lungs. Her son's scream fades into the Mediterranean wind. She sinks. She is one of dozens. Mothers who drowned chasing Roman ships. Ships carrying 300 children hostages ripped from Carthaginian arms as the price of peace. But there was no peace. Year 149 before Christ, Carthage had surrendered everything. 200,000 weapons, 2,000 catapults, 300 children. Rome took it all. Then Rome said, "Now abandon your city, move inland, let us burn everything you are." They had stripped themselves naked, and Rome wanted them dead anyway. So a city with no weapons chose to fight. Women sheared their hair for catapult ropes. Temples became forges. Slaves became soldiers. For 3 years, they held. When they fell, 50,000 marched into chains. The rest became ash. This is how Rome committed URB-side and wept while doing it. To understand the fury of year 149, you need to understand the 50 years before it. The Second Punic War ended in year 201 before Christ. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who had marched elephants over the Alps and nearly erased Rome from history, was finally defeated at the Battle of Zama. Rome won, but Rome did not forget. The peace treaty was designed to be a slow execution. Carthage lost everything beyond Africa. Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, all gone. Their legendary war fleet reduced to 10 ships for pirate patrol. Their war elephants surrendered, and then came the clause that would seal their fate. Article 6. Carthage could not wage war outside Africa, and inside Africa, only with explicit Roman permission. Think about what that means. Carthage's survival now depended on Rome's mood. Every border dispute, every raid, every act of self-defense required a permission slip from the Senate, and Rome had a watchdog ready to exploit it. His name was Massinissa, king of Numidia, Rome's loyal ally in North Africa. For 50 years, this man made Carthage's life hell. He understood Article 6 perfectly. Raid Carthaginian farmland, seize their crops, steal their territory slice by slice, and whenever Carthage raised an army to stop him, he ran to Rome screaming, "They're violating the treaty." Rome would send a commission. The commission would side with Massinissa every single time. It was brilliant. It was cruel. Modern strategists call it salami tactics, slice by slice until nothing remains. But Massinissa wasn't alone. In Rome, a voice grew louder every year. An old man, a veteran of the war against Hannibal. His name was Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Elder. In year 153 before Christ, Cato visited Carthage as part of an arbitration commission. He expected to find a broken city, beggars in the streets, empty markets. Instead, he found a thriving metropolis, overflowing granaries, a harbor choked with merchant ships, a population exploding with new life. Carthage had paid off its crushing 50-year debt early. Cato was terrified. He returned to Rome with one message, one obsession, one phrase he would repeat at the end of every speech regardless of the topic for the rest of his life: Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed, not defeated, not humiliated. Destroyed. Year 151 before Christ. The stranglehold finally snapped. Massinissa pushed too far. He besieged a Carthaginian town called Oroscopa. The democratic faction in Carthage had enough. They expelled the pro-Roman politicians. They raised an army, and they marched. No permission, no approval. They were done asking. The general's name was Hasdrubal, called the Boetharch. Remember that name. He will haunt this story until the very end. The campaign was a disaster. Hasdrubal was outmaneuvered by Massinissa, who was over 90 years old. The Carthaginian army was surrounded, starved, forced to surrender. But that wasn't the worst part. Massinissa's son, Gulusa, promised safe passage. The Carthaginians laid down their arms and began the long march home. Gulusa massacred them. Thousands of unarmed soldiers cut down in an ambush. A betrayal within a betrayal. But Rome didn't care about the dead. Rome cared about the treaty. Carthage had waged war without permission. They had given Rome the excuse it needed. Year 149 before Christ, spring. The Roman armada appeared on the horizon. 80,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 50 warships and hundreds of transports, their bronze rams glinting in the Mediterranean sun. The sound reached Carthage before the ships did. The creak of oars, the thunder of drums, the low drone of a war machine crossing the sea. They landed at Utica, an ancient Phoenician city just 20 miles north of Carthage. Utica had already defected. They could read the writing on the wall. Panic swept through the streets of Carthage. The city was unprepared. Hasdrubal's disaster had gutted their army. Their weapons were old. Their walls were strong, but walls don't fight alone. The Carthaginian Senate sent 30 ambassadors to the Roman camp. They carried one word: deditio, unconditional surrender. We give up. Completely. Tell us what you want. The Roman consul, Lucius Marcius Censorinus, smiled. He praised their wisdom. He spoke of peace, of Roman protection, of a bright future under the eagle. Then he made the first demand. To guarantee your loyalty, you must hand over 300 children from your noblest families. As hostages, the ambassadors hesitated. 300 children. The sons and daughters of senators, generals, priests. But what choice did they have? They agreed. The day the children left is recorded by the ancient historian Appian. The scene still haunts. 300 boys and girls, some barely old enough to walk, gathered at the harbor in the brutal summer heat. The salt wind carried the smell of tar and rope and fear. Their mothers came. They screamed. They clawed at the Roman guards. They tried to climb onto the ships, to be dragged away with their sons. Some women threw themselves into the water. They swam after the vessels, arms thrashing, voices breaking, until exhaustion pulled them under or Roman oars pushed them back. The ships disappeared over the horizon. Carthage had just given Rome its future, and Rome wasn't finished. The ambassadors returned to the Roman camp days later. Surely, they thought, the price had been paid. Censorinus received them warmly. Then he made the second demand. Since you are now under Roman protection, you have no need for weapons. Surrender all public arms and engines of war. The ambassadors went pale. All weapons? All. What followed was a parade of surrender. Wagon after wagon rolled out of Carthage's gates. The dust hung thick in the air, clogging throats, coating everything in a film of gray. 200,000 sets of armor, 200,000 swords and spears, 2,000 catapults and ballistae, countless javelins, arrows, siege equipment. The Roman officers watched in stunned silence. They hadn't expected this much. Carthage had been hoarding, preparing for a war they hoped would never come. Now, it was all gone. Every blade, every bolt, every sharpened edge that could draw Roman blood. Carthage stood naked, and only then did Rome reveal what it truly wanted. Censorinus called the ambassadors to his tent one final time. The air inside was heavy, hot, the smell of sweat and leather. The consul didn't waste words. You must abandon your city. The entire population is free to settle anywhere within your territory, provided it is at least 10 miles from the sea. Carthage itself will be razed to the ground. Silence, 10 miles from the sea. For a Carthaginian, the sea wasn't geography. It was identity, their religion, their economy, their history. Their ancestors had sailed from Phoenicia 1,000 years ago to build this city on the water. Move 10 miles inland? They might as well have said, "Stop being Carthaginian." It was a death sentence, disguised as mercy. The ambassadors returned to the city. What happened next? Appian calls it indescribable fury and madness. When the people of Carthage learned the truth that they had surrendered their children, their weapons, everything for nothing, they exploded. The ambassadors were torn apart in the streets. Senators who had counseled surrender were dragged from their homes and lynched. Any Italian found in the city was seized and butchered. The screaming echoed off the stone walls. The smell of blood mixed with the smoke of burning Roman trading posts. 300 children, gone. 200,000 weapons, gone. And Rome wanted more. No. The Carthaginian Senate declared war. They had no army, no fleet, no allies, no weapons. They had nothing except the walls and a fury that would burn for 3 years. What happened next was the ancient equivalent of total war. Every slave in the city was freed and conscripted. Every temple and public building was converted into a weapons factory. The forges burned day and night, the hammering so constant that the city itself seemed to pulse with it. And the numbers? Daily production reached 100 shields, 300 swords, 500 javelins, 1,000 missiles. By modern standards, Carthage had transformed itself into a wartime industrial economy in weeks, without steel mills, without assembly lines, without anything except desperation and rage. But they had a problem. Catapults, the torsion artillery that could shatter siege towers and scatter Roman formations required rope, strong rope made from sinew or flax. Carthage had neither, so the women of the city came forward. They unbound their hair, long braids that had taken years to grow, marks of beauty, of status, of identity. They sheared it off. Every strand was collected, twisted, woven into the springs that would power the city's new catapults. The women of Carthage gave their vanity to the war machine, and the war machine began to roar. The Roman consuls, Manilius and Censorinus, expected to walk into an open city. Instead, they found the gates sealed, the walls manned, and arrows raining down from catapults powered by human hair. The siege would not be a week-long police action. It would become a 3-year nightmare. But Rome had one advantage. Carthage could never match patience. They could afford to wait, to bleed, to rotate fresh legions into the meat grinder. Carthage could not, and somewhere in the Roman camp, a young officer was watching, learning, waiting for his moment. His name was Scipio Aemilianus. He was 37 years old, technically ineligible for high command. Within 2 years, Rome would break its own laws to give him the war, and he would finish what his grandfather started, whether he wanted to or not. The first 2 years of the siege were a humiliation, not for Carthage, for Rome. The consuls Manilius and Censorinus launched assault after assault against the Isthmus Wall, that triple line of stone and ditch that protected the landward approach. Every attack was thrown back. The makeshift Carthaginian catapults, powered by women's hair, proved devastatingly effective. Disease swept through the Roman camp. Censorinus had positioned his fleet in the stagnant waters of the Lake of Tunis. In the summer heat, the marshes became a breeding ground for fever. Men died in their tents, shivering and sweating, never having seen the enemy. When Censorinus finally moved the fleet to open water for fresh air, the Carthaginians launched fire ships. The smell of burning wood and tar, the screams of sailors trapped below deck, a significant portion of Rome's naval power, reduced to floating pyres in a single night. The siege had become a joke, and in Rome, the people were done laughing. Year 147 before Christ. Scipio Aemilianus returned to Rome. He wasn't supposed to be a hero. He had served in Africa as a military tribune, a mid-level officer, nothing more. But while the consuls fumbled, Scipio had distinguished himself again and again. When Roman soldiers rushed blindly into a breach and were slaughtered in a Carthaginian counterattack, Scipio held his men back, covered the retreat, saved the army. When a night raid threatened to overrun the Roman camp, Scipio led cavalry out the rear gate, circled around, and broke the enemy flank. When 400 Roman foragers were trapped on a hill, surrounded and doomed, Scipio led the relief column against heavy odds, and won. The old senator, Cato, in his final months of life, applied a line from Homer to describe him. He alone has wisdom. The rest are empty shadows. Even the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal requested to negotiate only with Scipio. He trusted the young officer's word more than the consul's. Now Scipio was back in Rome, running for the office of aedile, a minor position. But the people didn't want an aedile. They wanted a destroyer. Scipio was 37 years old. Roman law required a minimum age for the consulship. He hadn't served as praetor. He was technically ineligible for supreme command. The Senate didn't care. The people didn't care. They suspended the law. For 1 year. For one man, Scipio Aemilianus was elected consul and given sole command of the war in Africa. Rome had broken its own constitution to finish Carthage. Scipio arrived at Utica and found chaos. The Roman camp had degenerated into a market. Traders, prostitutes, looters, they outnumbered the soldiers. Officers slept on soft beds. Meals were served on fine pottery. The army had forgotten it was at war. Scipio's first act was expulsion. Every non-combatant, every luxury, every distraction, gone. He stood before his troops, and his voice carried the cold of his grandfather's legacy. You are more like robbers than soldiers. You are in quest of luxuries in the midst of war, and before the victory is won. Then came the drill. Marching, entrenching, marching again. He worked them until their hands bled from digging and their legs screamed from the weight of armor. Within weeks, the Roman army was an army again, and Scipio turned his attention to the harbor. Carthage could only survive if supplies reached the city by sea. Blockade runners slipped through at night, bringing grain, weapons, hope. Scipio decided to end that hope. He ordered the construction of a massive mole, a stone dam stretching from the isthmus into the sea, sealing the harbor mouth. Thousands of legionaries hauled rocks, drove pilings, built the barrier stone by stone. The Carthaginians watched from the walls. At first, they allowed. The sea was too deep, the currents too strong. The Romans were wasting their time. But the mole grew. Day after day, the entrance narrowed. The blockade runners found their passage shrinking. Panic set in, and the Carthaginians made a decision that stunned the ancient world. In absolute secrecy, working through the night, the people of Carthage began to dig, not outward, through. They carved a new channel from the inner Chthon, the circular military harbor, out to the open sea on the eastern side, bypassing the Roman mole entirely. At the same time, in the ship sheds hidden from Roman eyes, they built a new fleet, 50 triremes, constructed from scrap wood, salvaged timber, the bones of old buildings. No Roman scout detected it. No spy reported it. The secret held. And then, one morning, the Romans woke to shock. The new channel was open. The new fleet was sailing out. 50 warships, oars flashing, emerged from a harbor that was supposed to be sealed. Carthage had built an exit from its own grave. Here is where Carthage lost everything. The fleet sailed out in perfect formation. The Roman ships scrambled unprepared, vulnerable. If the Carthaginians had attacked immediately, if they had thrown everything into that moment of surprise, they might have destroyed the Roman navy, changed the war, bought more time. Instead, they paraded. They sailed in circles, showing off their strength, then returned to port. Why? Pride? Fear? We don't know. But it was a fatal hesitation. 3 days later, they sortied again for a real battle. The engagement was brutal, evenly matched, the crash of rams and the screams of drowning men filling the harbor. But as the Carthaginian fleet retreated, the smaller vessels clogged the narrow new channel. Ships ran aground, others collided. The escape became a traffic jam. Scipio pounced. Roman marines attacked the stranded ships against the quay. Vessel after vessel was captured or burned. The fleet Carthage had built in secret, their last hope of breaking the blockade, was shattered in a single afternoon. The noose was complete. One obstacle remained. Hasdrubal had entered the city to command the garrison. But outside the walls, a Carthaginian field army still held the fortress of Nepharis, raiding Roman supply lines, keeping a flicker of resistance alive. In the winter of year 147, Scipio turned his full attention to Nepharis. The assault was coordinated annihilation. A feigned retreat drew the Carthaginians out. Numidian cavalry, Rome's allies, circled behind. The trap closed. The ancient historian Appian claims 70,000 died. The number is probably exaggerated, but the meaning is clear. Total destruction. The field army ceased to exist. No relief was coming, no reinforcements, no hope from outside the walls. Carthage stood alone, and starvation began to hollow the city from within. The attack came in spring. Scipio launched his assault on the harbor district. Hasdrubal, anticipating the blow, ordered the commercial harbor's warehouses set on fire, denying the Romans any supplies. But the Romans weren't aiming for the warehouses. A unit led by Scipio's lieutenant, Laelius, scaled the walls of the Cathon, the circular military harbor, the fortress within the fortress. The defenders were weak. Months of starvation had hollowed them. They fought, but they couldn't hold. The Romans poured over the walls, seized the circular quay, pushed into the market square. They now controlled the lower city. Between them and the Bursa, the high citadel where the survivors huddled, lay the residential heart of Carthage. A steep hill, covered in 6-story apartment buildings. 3 main avenues leading upward. The 3 streets. This is where the siege became slaughter. The Carthaginians turned every building into a fortress. From the rooftops, they hurled stones, tiles, javelins. From the windows, they fired arrows and flung boiling liquid. Every step the Romans took upward cost blood. Scipio realized he couldn't advance on street level. He ordered a new tactic: vertical warfare. Capture the first row of houses. Clear them floor by floor, room by room, blade to blade. Then lay wooden planks across the narrow alleys. Bridge the gaps between rooftops. Fight upward. The legionaries leaped from roof to roof, crashing through doors, killing everything that moved. The buildings became vertical battlefields, staircases slick with blood, corridors choked with bodies. And to prevent the Carthaginians from reoccupying cleared buildings, Scipio ordered them burned. The fires spread. 6-story buildings collapsed into the streets. Stone and timber and people crushed together in smoking heaps. But the streets needed to be cleared. Cavalry reinforcements were waiting. Fresh troops needed passage. Scipio gave the order. Roman soldiers grabbed hooks and pikes. They dragged the rubble aside. They dragged the bodies aside. Some were dead, some were not. The ancient historian Appian recorded what he saw, or what Polybius, who was there, told him. There were visible the heads of some, the legs of others, and the torsos of others, writhing in the flames or gasping for breath. The living were thrown into pits with the dead, used as landfill, packed down to level the road. And when the cavalry finally advanced, the horses galloped over them, crushing their faces and skulls, not on purpose, but because of the madness of war. For 6 days and 6 nights, the slaughter continued. Scipio barely slept. He sat on a high terrace overlooking the burning city, directing the rotation of fresh maniples into the inferno. Exhausted units stumbled out. Fresh units marched in. The grinding machine never stopped. Below him, the fires roared. The screams rose and fell like waves. The smell of smoke and roasting flesh filled every breath. He watched it all. He did not look away. On the 7th day, silence. The survivors on the Bursa, 50,000 men, women, and children, raised the signal of surrender. They emerged from the citadel bearing olive branches, their clothes hanging from skeletal frames, their eyes hollow. They asked for one thing only, their lives. Scipio granted it. 50,000 souls, the remnants of a city that had once held 700,000. They were placed under guard, counted, catalogued, destined for the slave markets of Rome. But the story wasn't over. 900 refused to surrender. They retreated to the Temple of Eshmun at the very summit of the Bursa. Most were Roman deserters, men who knew that capture meant crucifixion. They had nothing to lose. With them was Hasdrubal, the general who had lost to Massinissa, the general who had been condemned to death, then recalled to save the city, the general who had demanded his people fight to the last breath. And with Hasdrubal, his wife, and their 2 young sons, For days, they held the temple roof, starving, burning, waiting for an end that wouldn't come. Then Hasdrubal's nerve broke. In the darkness, Hasdrubal slipped away. He crawled down from the temple. He presented himself to Scipio. He fell to his knees. He begged. The man who had screamed defiance, the man who had rallied his people to die on their feet, the general of Carthage, kneeling in the dirt, pleading for his life. Scipio looked at him and granted it. Hasdrubal would live. He would march in Scipio's triumph through the streets of Rome, a trophy, a symbol of Carthaginian humiliation. The loop closes here, but his wife had other plans. The deserters on the temple roof saw their general surrender. They set the temple on fire. If they couldn't live, they would choose their death. And in that moment, Hasdrubal's wife appeared. She stood on the burning roof, dressed in her finest remaining clothes. Her 2 children stood beside her, small and trembling. She looked down at Scipio. She looked down at her husband, kneeling in the Roman dust, and she screamed. Appian and Polybius both recorded her words. They echo across 2,000 years. For you, Roman, the gods have no cause of indignation. You exercise the right of war. But upon this Hasdrubal, betrayer of his country and his gods, of me and his children, may the gods of Carthage take vengeance, and may you be their instrument. She turned to her husband. Wretch, traitor, most effeminate of men, this fire will entomb me and my children. Will you, the leader of great Carthage, decorate a Roman triumph? What punishment will you not receive from him, at whose feet you are now sitting? She drew a blade. She cut the throats of her children. She threw their bodies into the flames. And then she leaped. That was the last free act of Carthage. Not Hasdrubal's surrender, her defiance. The temple burned. The city burned. 17 days of fire until there was nothing left to consume. And Scipio Aemilianus, the man who had achieved Rome's greatest victory, the destroyer of Carthage, the closer of a war that had haunted Rome for a century, wept. His friend Polybius, the historian who had tutored him since childhood, stood beside him. He asked the question everyone wanted to ask. Why do you cry? This is your moment of glory. Scipio grasped his hand and quoted Homer, the Iliad, Book 6. A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain. Polybius pressed him. What do you mean? Scipio answered, It is a glorious moment, Polybius, but I have a dread foreboding that someday the same doom will be pronounced on my own country. He wasn't crying for Carthage. He was crying for Rome. He had just witnessed the death of a civilization, a city that had stood for 700 years, a culture that had sailed the seas, built temples, raised children, buried grandparents, gone. And he knew that empires do not last. Assyria fell, Media fell, Persia fell, Macedon fell, Carthage fell. Rome would fall too. He saw it in the flames, the future written in ash. 50,000 survivors were marched to the coast. They were loaded onto ships, transported to Sicily, auctioned in the slave markets. Many ended up on the latifundia, the vast agricultural estates that fed Rome's growing appetite. They worked the fields until they died. Their children were born into chains. Within a decade, the brutality of these estates would spark the First Servile War, a massive slave uprising that would shake Sicily to its foundations. The destruction of Carthage didn't just erase a city, it planted the seeds of Rome's own internal collapse. You may have heard the legend that Scipio plowed the earth and sowed it with salt, cursing the land forever. It's a powerful image. It's also false. No ancient source mentions salt. Not Polybius, not Appian, not Livy, not Plutarch. The story doesn't appear until the 19th century, a myth invented nearly 2,000 years after the fact. The reality? Rome wanted the land. The territory of Carthage was declared public property. It was leased to Roman investors. Within a generation, North Africa became the breadbasket of Rome, supplying the capital with grain for centuries. Scipio did place a religious curse on the Bursa itself. No one was to live on that sacred ground. But the curse didn't hold. In year 122 before Christ, Gaius Gracchus tried to found a colony on the site. In year 29 before Christ, Augustus finally rebuilt Carthage as a Roman city. It grew to become the second largest city in the Western Roman Empire, a center of trade, culture, and eventually Christianity. Carthage rose again under Roman masters. So let's return to the question: how do you destroy a city that has already surrendered? The answer is simple. You make them surrender everything first. Take their hostages so they can't rebel without sacrificing their children. Take their weapons so they can't fight back. Take their dignity so they forget how to resist. And then you destroy them. Rome didn't defeat Carthage in battle. Rome defeated Carthage in a negotiation. The city that gave everything to live was erased because it dared to survive. That's the first irony. Here's the second. Hasdrubal demanded his people die fighting. He screamed about honor, about resistance, about the glory of a Carthaginian death. And when the end came, he crawled. His wife didn't. She stood on the burning temple and answered him with fire. She chose the flames over Roman chains. Her children went with her not as victims, but as her final defiance. History doesn't remember Hasdrubal's speeches. History remembers her leap. And here's the third irony, the deepest one. Scipio won. He achieved everything Rome wanted. The ghost of Hannibal was exorcised. The rival civilization was erased. The Mediterranean belonged to Rome alone. And he wept, because victory taught him something that defeat never could. Empires end. He had just ended one, and standing in the ashes, watching the flames consume 700 years of history, he saw his own empire's future. He was right. Rome would burn. Different enemies, different fires, but the same end. Scipio saw it first. History doesn't remember what Carthage surrendered. It remembers what Rome took. 200,000 weapons couldn't save them. 300 children couldn't buy them mercy. 700,000 souls couldn't make Rome hesitate, because surrender is never enough. For those who want annihilation, the women who sheared their hair, gone. The slaves who became soldiers, gone. The children who were ripped from their mothers at the harbor, we don't know what happened to them. History doesn't record their names. They were hostages. Then they were nothing. And the man who burned it all, he quoted Homer as the flames rose. A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish. He wasn't celebrating. He was mourning. Not for Carthage, for the future. For the empire that would rise on Carthage's ashes and one day inevitably, unstoppably become ash itself. 50,000 slaves, 17 days of fire, one prophecy. Scipio saw the end of Rome in the death of Carthage. And 200 years later, the fire reached Italy. Carthage asked for mercy. Rome answered with salt that never existed, and flames that never stopped burning. Because the real curse wasn't on the land. It was on the victors. Scipio knew. He saw it in the fire, and he wept.